The Hay of Seaton lecture. The lectureship exists as stipulated in the original bequest to, and I quote, to promote greater understanding and the furtherance of the knowledge of the history and culture of the Jewish people. Since the first of these lectures, given in 1988 by Cardinal Willebrand, at that point the President Emeritus of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity in the Vatican, on his chosen theme, The Church Faces Modern Anti-Semitism, our university here in Aberdeen has benefited from a dozen such lectures, featuring speakers including David Novak, Zygmunt Bauman, John Levinson, Abba Eban, and most recently, Michael Berkowitz in 2019. I'm especially grateful this evening that there should be members of the Hay family, including Angus, from whom we'll hear in a minute, Malcolm and his daughter Isabella, who have traveled a distance to be with us. I'm also grateful to the officers and the representatives of the Aberdeen Synagogue and Jewish community who are here, and to the members from the university's Jewish Student Society who are also attending. Also, I'd like to be sure that we welcome Mr. Edward Green, a long-serving leader of the Edinburgh Hebrew congregation, who 2016 has also been the first Jewish Deputy Lord Lieutenant in the city of Edinburgh, and we're glad that he's made the trip this evening to be with us. It's good that you are all here. With that, let me begin by inviting Angus Hay to come and speak. Angus is a representative of the family on the university's Hay of Seaton Lectureship Committee, and he's kindly agreed to share with us a few remarks this evening at the outset of our time together about his grandfather, Major Malcolm Hay of Seaton, in whose honor this lectureship is named.
Well, good evening, everybody. First of all, can you hear me at the back? I don't need to be any louder. Very good. Well, very briefly, thank you for that introduction. I was asked some years ago, prior to one of these lectures, by some friends of mine who attended, to explain who was Malcolm Hay, and just give a bit of background why we're all here for this particular event. He was my grandfather, as Philippa said, and also the grandfather of my cousin Malcolm, sitting there, and great-grandfather of my cousin Isabella. He was born in 1882, was educated at Beaumont, and he is a classic scholar. He was a soldier, a landowner, a linguist, spoke French and Hebrew fluently, and an author. What was his connection with Judaism, and how did an Aberdeenshire laird become involved, and how did this lecture series come about? That's my grandfather in his hay, tartan and his bonnet. He was brought up at Seaton House, which is just outside the cathedral and Seaton Park. And that's where he's brought up as a young man and child. As a young man, a fairly young man, he joined the 3rd Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders, our local regiment, and he joined the militia, the 3rd Battalion, rather like people now join the TA, so he was not a regular soldier. It's the sort of thing expected of a landowner in those days to do. When World War I was declared in August 1914, he was called up and was transferred to the 1st Battalion, which is a regular battalion, with the rank of lieutenant. He was 32 years old, which is quite elderly to be a soldier. He relayed a story I had that when he was at Seaton, he got told to take his broadsword, his officer's sword, to the blacksmith on the Bridge of Don and have it sharpened. And he said that's the most frightening thing of this whole wartime experience. I've got that sword. He went off to France with the 1st Battalion, Gordon Highlanders. His war was very short. He survived the Battle of Mons, where, as a linguist and speaking French, he was used as the officer interpreting the billeting, and he also commanded a platoon of soldiers. But at the Battle of Linklater in August 1914, he got shot straight through the head. He collapsed straight into his trench and was basically dying. As he lay in the ground in the mud, dying, his batman, his soldier servant, came up and said, "Mr. Hay's dead." And my grandfather patted his tunic like that. And the soldier looked in his tunic, and there's a great big flask of brandy. And the soldier poured the brandy down my grandfather, and he reckoned that saved his life because it gave him such a shock. Anyway, it was a bit of a disaster, the Battle of Linklater, and the British Army troops were told to withdraw, leaving their immobile wounded behind. His soldiers tried to carry him, but he was in such pain, having been shot in the head, that it was more painful to be carried, so he told them, "Leave me." And he got left by a wood in the pouring rain throughout the night, semi-conscious and partially paralyzed. The following morning, some French stretcher bearers from a nearby village went out to collect the wounded from the battlefield. And one group found Malcolm and decided to leave him, saying, "Il est mort," he is dead. Malcolm, French speaker, sat up and to their great surprise said, "Mais non, je suis pas mort." But no, I'm not dead. So he was then taken to the nearby village and shortly afterwards, with other wounded Gordon Highlanders, was rounded up by the Germans. He's now a POW. That's him in his hat. That's the Battle of Cateau. He was taken to the hospital at Cambrai, where by chance, and luckily for him, a renowned brain surgeon was staying. A life-saving operation was performed and Malcolm's life was saved. They opened up his head and pulled out all the wrecked skull, and he survived. For the rest of his life, he had a metal plate across one side of his head, and his balance was difficult. He needed a stick for the rest of his life. As a horrible little grandchild, I remember myself trying to say which side of his head the plate was in. We could never work it out. He was then transferred to Germany, where he was a POW. He was able, though, to organize an exchange, a prison exchange, because it was recognized or seen that he was too ill, too damaged to be able to fight anymore. So he duly came back to Aberdeen. And following a year's convalescence at Seaton, he wanted to continue to do something for the country, even though he could no longer physically fight. So he was recruited by the intelligence services to head up their newly established decoding intelligence gathering department. He recruited some of the best classic scholars from the universities and cerebral linguists available, put them into a uniform, called them all captain, and made the department known as Room 40 into great success. It was decoding, so they were able to decode the messages which the Germans were passing backwards and forwards, and that was then passed up to the military bureaucracy to take action as and when required. The work he did in World War I in Room 40 can be said to have been the foundation for the intelligence work carried out at Bletchley Park. And so there he is, intelligence 1I, 1B. And you can see him at the back here, where the arrows point out. He was told he was going to get a decoration, probably a K, but he turned it down because he considered the British military hierarchy hadn't acted fast enough on some of the information he got given, and it didn't help the war. And equally, his staff were also recommended for decorations, and they all turned them down. 5 years ago at Bletchley Park, they had an exhibition. That's me. A stand with a whole lot of photographs, which I've got, and Malcolm's got some as well. And it was a very nice stand. I duly arrived, and I was meant to be the guest of honour, so frightfully important. But they said, "Would you mind waiting a bit, Mr. Hay?" And I said, "Oh, all right, what's happening?" "You've been outranked. The Princess Royal's there." So I had to wait for the royal family to go there before me. Because of his injuries, he couldn't do the sort of things a person of his background would normally expect to do, the shooting and the golf and whatever. He had a first-class brain, so he started to write books. And some of them, and most of them, were involved with Catholicism. Very, very good, well-written books, but very, very serious. And because of that, he got known in Rome, and the Vatican heard about him. And when he visited Rome in 1931, he had a private audience of Pope Pius XI. And that particular pope was lame as well and had a special lift from the ground floor to his private apartments in the Vatican. And grandfather was invited into the lift up to the pope's apartments on the first floor, which was quite an honour. And instead of having the usual 10 minutes or so that people get, he was given a full hour of talking to the pope. That was the famous pope. And I was in the Vatican some years ago, and I remember seeing the corner of the pope's apartments, just a corner. For the Second World War, he became the convener, the head of the North East of Scotland Prisoner of War Appeal. And this is of particular interest because he'd been a prisoner, as I said, in the First World War, and my father was also a Gordon Highlander. He got captured and spent 5 years in the prison. When all our soldiers were captured, beginning of mid-1940, the Germans weren't at all prepared to feed 40,000 new people. So they were beginning to get very, very hungry, the prisoners. There wasn't enough food for them all. So in Britain, we set up the Prisoner of War Appeal, which was a project between the Venerable Order of St. John of Jerusalem and the Red Cross. And grandfather was the one who ran the operation in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire and Banffshire. We raised money for the food and clothing parcels that were sent out to the British POWs in German camps in Germany, Austria and Poland. And they consisted of life-saving food. So 4 prisoners, and it's all ranks, 4 prisoners in a camp would get together. So a parcel would arrive for me and 3 of my mates, but only 2 would actually arrive, so they shared it. And they were just beginning to starve by the autumn of 1940. These arrived at the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, and it kept a lot of prisoners alive. Whilst he was running this, he met his second wife, Alice Ivy Patterson. His first wife, our grandmother, was dying in Seaton and had actually died by then. And she, Ivy Patterson, lived over near Arford with her then husband and was the secretary and the organizer for the parcels business. Ivy's daughter had married in 1932 the then Lieutenant Ord Wingate, later General Ord Wingate. He was an artillery officer and very much into Christianity of various shapes and sizes. He was posted to Palestine, to the British Army, in 1938, and there he became closely involved with Zionism, which was unusual for a British officer at the time, who tended to be more enthusiastic about Arabs rather than the Jews for all sorts of reasons from a long time ago. And he supported the Jews in that troubled time of the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. And Ord Wingate raised something called the Special Night Squads, in which many latter high officials of the state of Israel were involved as young men. Wingate subsequently became a general and commanded the Chindits in Burma. Was killed in an aeroplane crash in 1944. So, Wingate's wife, Alice Ivy, and his wife, so mother-in-law wife, became firm supporters of Judaism, Zionism, via Wingate's influence. So our grandfather's second wife married Ord Wingate, who was a supporter of Zionism, and their enthusiasm for Zionism and Judaism is what got my grandfather involved. The friendship with Ivy Patterson was a catalyst which commenced Malcolm's interest in Judaism and Zionism. He wrote several books on the subject. The 2 best known in 1950 was The Foot of Pride, a bestseller in America and translated into several languages, including Hebrew, and the other one was Thy Brother's Blood. So he wrote a lot about Zionism. Malcolm's first wife, my grandmother, had died in 1944, and Malcolm married Ivy finally, who was by then a widow herself, in 1958. They spent a lot of time in Palestine. Grandfather Malcolm, learnt Hebrew, bought a house in Haifa. When the British authorities said all British must leave the Holy Land, he didn't, and he became a bit of a fugitive for a time when the British were looking for him and the Arabs were looking for him, but he survived. They associated with many of the luminaries of the new state of Israel. Chaim Weizmann. He actually came here and stayed in our home at Seaton, and I got the letters which he wrote to my grandfather thanking him for staying, and Golda Meir also came and stayed. In her will, Ivy left a considerable endowment to the University of Aberdeen in memory of her husband to be used to fund a series of lectures, the Hay of Seaton Memorial Lectures. And Philip has already told you what the aim of it was, but I'll just repeat it. The objectives were and are the promotion of better understanding and furtherance of the knowledge of the history and culture of the Jewish people, and nowadays to develop knowledge and understanding between Judaism and Christianity, and today with Islam. Every 3 to 4 years, a guest speaker is invited to become a scholar, a politician, or a religious. And today, in this afternoon, we have the Chief Rabbi in Scotland coming to talk to us. So that's a very brief outline of who my grandfather was and why we're here now.
Good. Let me take just a very brief moment to introduce our speaker this evening. It's my pleasure and my privilege to do so. Rabbi Moshe Rubin, born in the United States, raised and educated there, in Israel and latterly in Manchester, before moving to Scotland to complete his rabbinical studies in 1989. Soon after that, he joined Rabbi Greenberg as part of the leadership team at Glasgow's Giffnock Synagogue. He succeeded Rabbi Greenberg there as the leader of that community upon the latter's retirement in 1999, being inducted by the chief rabbi in the autumn of that year. He has continued to serve as its rabbi ever since, and continues now in 2025 to serve the newly united Synagogue of Giffnock, Newton, Mearns. Since 2013, he has also served as the senior rabbi of Scotland and the head of the Glasgow Beth. In his rabbinical role, he also serves as the chaplain to Newark Care Homes, to the Jewish Care of Scotland, and to the Glasgow Burial Society. Also in that role, he's the chaplain of the Calderwood Lodge Primary School, which is the only Jewish primary school in Scotland, and one which, since 2017, in a unique partnership, shares a campus with St. Clair's Roman Catholic School, a world first, it seems, for such an educational collaboration in whose foundation he played an important part. More recently than that, he was a contributor to the Jewish Christian Glossary Project, a project jointly undertaken by the Office of the Chief Rabbi and the Church of Scotland, which officially launched in 2024. We're delighted to have you with us this evening, Rabbi Rubin, as our Hay of Seaton lecturer for this year. We look forward to your talk, which you've entitled The Influencers of Jewish Life in Scotland. Welcome.
Before I begin, I must make a little correction over there. Especially it's being filmed. I'm not the chief rabbi of Scotland because we have a chief rabbi based in London, and he might get very upset with someone else. But thank you for that introduction. And I begin with a thank you to Professor Ziegler, to Philip, for your invitation to give this lecture this evening. And also a recognition to Dr. Ehud Rutter. Thank you for your support, and most of all, for your work on behalf of Aberdeen Jewish community. Angus, tonight I'm going to talk about influencers. And your grandfather Malcolm Hay of Seaton, and his wife, the late wife Alice Ivy, rate high up there as influencers for a better and kinder mankind. And I am honored to be standing in yours and Malcolm and Isabella's Hayes company. The title of my lecture is The Influences of Jewish Life in Scotland. I used the word influencers purposely. This past August, at the Wimbledon tennis tournament, there was an influencer, Maya Zello. Some of the younger people might recognize that name. Maya Zello, an influencer. She managed to gain 170,000 followers on various social media platforms. And as a true influencer, she was deciding for people what they should wear, what they should eat and drink, and how they should think. And then, after the tournament, she was found out. It was revealed that she was fictional, a creation of AI. Today, I would like to share with you some people that I feel have influenced Scottish Jewry and continue to influence the future. However, these people and organizations, people who were passionate about Jewish community and driven to make life better for others, became true influencers and heroes of Scottish Jewry through sheer hard work and sacrifice. Let me say at the outset, I am I'm no historian. There are great historians of Scottish Jewry who will be able to share with you the history from its beginning, from when the first Jew arrived on these shores in the early 17th century. There's Dr. Kenneth Collins, who has written extensively on this subject in his books, Scotland's Jew, The Jewish Experience in Scotland from Immigration to Integration, and Second City Jewry, The Jews of Glasgow in the Age of Expansion, 1790 to 1919. There is also the Scottish Archive Centre in Glasgow and Harvey Kaplan, who are far more experts than I am on the subject. But what I would like to share with you this evening is how certain people, certain organizations, and decisions has had an impact on Scottish Jewry and made my work in Scotland, and in Glasgow in particular, possible. I will illustrate to you how, despite the declining numbers from its heyday, so let's start with my beginning. As you have picked up by now that my accent is not your classic Scottish accent, and most definitely not a Glaswegian accent. I once saw a newspaper vendor outside Waverley Station in Edinburgh, and it had a sign that said, "English spoken, American understood." When people ask me, where is my accent from? In typical Jewish style, I answer back with a question, as I am interested to hear their impression, because I believe that people form their stereotypical views and perceptions about others according to where they think they're from. So some people detect an Irish accent that creates a whole series of stereotyping. Others suggest an accent from somewhere in the Highlands and some island in Scotland. And then others hear, correctly, an American accent. But then comes the question, which part of America? Because that will pigeonhole me into a character of that perceived area of America. Well, I am a New Yorker. To be more precise, I'm a Brooklynite. But that does not say anything about who I am. Brooklyn, which has most probably the largest Jewish population outside Israel, is made up of communities within communities. I have cousins whose lives revolve around a radius of 2 or 3 miles. Within that small area, they are schooled, they met their partners, found their careers, they raise their children, have all their provisions, and stepping outside that zone is a massive event and makes them feel cosmopolitan. A few weeks ago, my sister phoned me to tell me she's sending me a link that will make me smile. A few minutes later, a link drops into my email box, which I click on, and it opens to a video clip of what must be 1980. I was 10 years old and living in Brooklyn, a place called Flatbush. And there I was in my father's small synagogue, celebrating the festival of Purim, which is a celebration full of singing, dancing, drinking, and eating, and more drinking. Looking back at that time, it was idyllic. I had everything that a child could wish for. And if you would have tried to predict what my future will be, the most logical answer would have been the 3-mile zone. That's me, 3-mile zone. An international trip means going to Manhattan. The 3 Mile Zone had its unique culture, its own New York accent, its own way of perceiving the world outside this zone. However, what is common to my life today in Scotland, 45 years later, is much of that communal infrastructure, maybe in a smaller scale, but nevertheless, it's there. Similar structure. Added to this structure is the community characters, the ones who add spice and humor to all communities. This infrastructure you will find in every successful community. And in my opinion, when communities are no longer able to support and sustain this infrastructure, you must start asking yourself, is this community viable? When this unique infrastructure is no longer affordable, you are witnessing the beginning of a community in decline. So what is the infrastructure? And why is this infrastructure replicated in Jewish communities around the world? As always in Judaism, and I think your grandfather would have known this, the Talmud provides the answer. The Talmud, which was completed at the end of the 5th century, is, after the Bible, the central text of rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of Jewish religious law, Jewish philosophy, Jewish customs, Jewish ethics, and most important of all, it codified, in a general way, the structure for the diaspora Jewry. The diaspora Jewry became the mainstream Jewish life after the end of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, which ended with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. It was a structure that would ensure Judaism continues to flourish and survive and thrive, even whilst living in a host country that many times, sadly, was hostile to its Jewish citizens. In the Talmud, there is the following teaching that for me outlines this infrastructure that I am referring to. I'm going to paraphrase the teaching. At the heart of the community, says this Talmud, you need scholarship and expertise on many issues, almost on all issues. Hence, the Talmud models a community for this scholarship to thrive. The Talmud outlines this model with 10 priorities, 10 components. Let me read out the ones that I feel are relevant for our society today. Number 1, a justice system. 2, charity and a welfare system. A synagogue. A religious ritual pool. A health system. A ritual slaughterer. And most importantly of all, a teacher of young children. Education. If you look around at Jewish communities around the world, you will find either all or most of these components in their community structure. What was and always is also very important for the success of this structure is the relationship between the Jewish community, its leaders, and the local authority of the city, of the town, of the village, and just the general population. And Jewish communities worked hard to forge a strong relationship. However, equally, you would find that the implementation and success of these functions depended on a few great forward thinkers, in other words, influencers. It depended on the commitment to Jewish traditions. And its ongoing success depended and depends on the continued commitment of the community to Jewish values and principles. Another important factor for success, and this is important, and this is, I would say, one of the most difficult parts of running a community, an important factor for success is the willingness of these people, these influencers, to share the credit, and the willingness of the leaders to bring on board others who also possess skills, talent, and ideas, most of the time younger people. Most importantly is listening and implementing their views. In other words, looking at the bigger picture and not being hindered by one's own ego. Just last Saturday, we had an octogenarian who led a particular section of the service called the Mafter. He led this for the first time in 60 years. His comment to me was that when he was growing up, just after his bar mitzvah, his 13th birthday, he was barred from leading this prayer as he was considered too young. Well, let me tell you that whereas 60 years ago, I could safely assume that 75% of my community had the ability to lead that part of the service, today it's just 10%. A skill that is almost forgotten by the common man. All because 60 years ago, the opportunity was not offered to younger people. So, for Scotland, who are these people? Who are these major influencers? Who are these passionate, dedicated, and driven people that established Scottish Jewry and in many respects laid the roots for my time and hopefully the future? I feel that if we are looking at Scottish Jewry, we must give credit and recognition to this august institution, Aberdeen University. You must be wondering how. Which is the 5th oldest in English-speaking world, I believe. Don't think anyone over here was there in those days? I don't know. A university that was formed in 1860 as a merger between King College and, I'm sure I'll get this wrong, the Marsical College. Take that? Okay. In its Mariscal or Marshall College era, in 1739, Jacob di Castro Sarmento from London was awarded an MD degree, the first medical degree awarded to a Jew in the English-speaking world, maybe the first of any degrees awarded to any Jew. Jacob's influence, he lived in London, and Jacob's influence in medicine went way beyond his lifetime. And perhaps today, much of the incredible advances of medicine has its roots in that research and the research of others of his time. The title of this lecture is The Influences of Jewish Life in Scotland. And in that context, by the fact that this college, Aberdeen University, offered Jacob the degree, making this the first degree offered to a Jew, says much about Scotland at the time, not that many years after the Acts of Union, at times still in ecclesiastical and political turmoil. However, I thought it best to focus on what I feel has influenced Scottish Jewry today, by way of using some of the list codified in the Talmud. So the first on the list was justice. In other words, integrity and honesty. I arrived, and I know this is being recorded, and I hope what I say does not get me into trouble. I arrived in Glasgow 1989, 20 years old, for a 2-year period. So when you see my wife, she still believes we're in the 2-year period. And I arrived to study at the Glasgow Rabbinical College that was based in Giffnock, the south side of Glasgow. Somehow, in some way, within a few months, I found myself becoming a member of the Glasgow Rabbinate, a very junior member, but nevertheless on the team. At the time, the senior rabbinical team, whose names you mentioned some of their names, Rabbi Greenberg and others, made up of great leaders, passionate about education, dedicated to their pastoral duties, and highly respected in the community. However, I felt there seemed to be a tension between the rabbis. This tension was felt in every area of community life. There was a difference of opinion in the style of education we should be presenting to the community, both adult education and children's education. There was a tension in the level of observance we should demand or expect of our community. There was a tension in who should be leading our community. As a young man, I found this sometimes entertaining, but also frustrating. A feeling that was shared by other young rabbis and the lay leaders of the community. However, one of the lessons I learned as I got older and I got into a senior role, a rabbinical role, is that not all intercommunal divisions is down to ego. Ego or pride, selfishness, and politics. Many times, and actually, I will suggest most of the time, it's about a genuine debate and passionate views about what is right and what is wrong, what is healthy for a community and what is dangerous for a community and its future. In my own time, 28 years as senior rabbi to my community, I have witnessed massive changes in so many different areas of communal life. The smartphone ubiquity, the rise and influence of the selfie culture. Today, if you haven't taken that picture of your Starbucks coffee, then you haven't truly experienced that coffee. The changing views on the definition of marriage and family, social media, and the list goes on and on. There isn't a norm of 20 years ago that is not being challenged today, and mostly by the Gen Z. If you would have gone to sleep in 1600 and woken up 100 years later in 1700, there would have been very little changes in the world. But if you go to sleep in 2015 and wake up in 2025, and I'm being generous over here, so much would have changed. But not only your iPhone, but also how you think, the issues that bother you, and how we perceive the world and traditions around us. And the challenge is, how do I, as a leader, give spiritual guidance in such a fast-changing world? And the deeper question is, how do I recognize the mores of our time without compromising on the traditions that have maintained us throughout history? I was recently chatting with the chief rabbi, the real chief rabbi, Rabbi Mervis, Sir Rabbi Mervis, about the challenge today of recruiting rabbis to rabbinical positions. I expressed to the chief rabbi that I sometimes ask myself, if I would have taken on the rabbinical position knowing the kind of issues I have to deal with today, my hesitation would have been, how do I maintain the authenticity of our faith and traditions? And how do I make these traditions relevant to Gen Z? I ask myself on a daily basis, when I look into a mirror, am I the same person with the same values and integrity that I was 28 years ago when I stepped into this big role? These questions and challenges didn't begin in the last 20 or 30 years. It began when the refugees began arriving on the shores of Scotland from Russia, Lithuania, and Poland in the turn of the century. And even more so when the survivors of the Holocaust began arriving and rebuilding their shattered lives. It was a challenge happening in almost every Jewish home. As the parents, many Yiddish-speaking people know what Yiddish is? It was a language that the Jews spoke amongst themselves, which is in certain communities today is very, very alive. My grandchildren in America speak perfect Yiddish, and in other communities it's totally forgotten. But these people grew up in these Yiddish-speaking homes, and they had children and wanted them to have a far better opportunities than they ever had. In the 60s and 70s in Glasgow, there were two great rabbinical leaders, Dr. Reverend I.K. Cosgrove, who was the minister of Garnet Hill Synagogue, the first purpose-built synagogue in Scotland, and Rabbi Diane Gottlieb, the minister of Queen's Park Synagogue. As their title suggests, Reverend Cosgrove was of the English gentleman ilk and ethos. And Rabbi Gottlieb was a more traditional Eastern European kind of rabbi. Dr. Cosgrove wore the traditional door collar and canonical robes at the services, and Rabbi Gottlieb looked more like yours truly, long black coat and even bigger black hat. Their rivalry was legendary. Of course, they had each their own followers, and each side would defend their spiritual leader and demand the highest respect for their leader. At the time, it was a rivalry which created tension and some divisions. However, I strongly believe that they complemented each other, in that one tempered the other. Rabbi Gottlieb made sure that Reverend Cosgrove's ideas do not lose the ancient traditions. And Reverend Cosgrove made sure that all, no matter their level of faith, and no matter if they were drifting from the Eastern European way of Jewish life, they felt valued, respected, and always had a place in the community. Today, at least in Glasgow, and I think we could say that for around Scotland, even though the challenges are still there, but there's a much stronger cohesiveness, I feel, between the ministers and just generally inter-community. And I feel that these ministers and their colleagues and all their debates and differences, they paved the way for an equilibrium that we have today. Once we mention Cosgrove, Reverend Cosgrove, that leads me on to another major area of community structure, and that is the charitable sector, an area of community that was very much at the heart of Reverend Cosgrove. The word in Hebrew for charity is tzedakah, which is loosely translated as charity. However, Hebrew etymologists will tell you that the root of the word is tzedek, which means justice. In other words, being charitable is not just about being moral, it is actually judicious. Having a charitable organization supporting the needs in the community is having justice in the community. If you look back into the Talmud, you learn that in its time, when the majority of Jews lived in what is referred to in the Talmudical literature as Babylonia, or in modern times, Iran, Iraq, and that region, including Israel, the Jews had a form of autonomy and self-governance. Besides the taxes that were enforced from the state, they also had the power to collect their own communal taxes. And a major percentage of these taxes was ring-fenced for the needy. Enshrined in the Torah is the rules of agriculture set-asides that were only allowed to be gathered and collected by the poor. It was this ethos that has continued from generation to generation, from country to country, from one persecution to another persecution. Even in the ghettos of Poland, Łódź, Warsaw, there were charity organizations. The functions of the charity organizations changed with the needs of the community. A Scottish organization that encapsulates this evolution is Jewish Care Scotland, which has been recognized over the years with awards which include the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service in 2012 and the Investing in Volunteers Award. The welfare organizations dates back to 1856, with the founding of the Glasgow Hebrew Philanthropic Society. At the same time, similar welfare boards were being established in Edinburgh, Dundee, and here in Aberdeen. They were all responding to the influx of immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, where there was always the threat of pogrom and other harsh anti-Jewish laws. So they came to Scotland for a better life. The story is told actually that they came to Scotland thinking they were in America. But whatever, I think what happened really was they came to Scotland and they couldn't afford to go further onto America. And they established themselves here. However, they arrived on the shores of Scotland with very little provisions. And these charities supported them in so many innovative ways, helping them rebuild their lives. One charity that caught my eye was the one set up by a group of ladies. And it was to provide shoes, basic shoes for children in the late 1800s. Just shoes. Other charities included an orphanage to look after children whose parents succumbed to different epidemics. I'll just share with you an interesting, it's not on my notes, an interesting experience I had. There were recently, a few years ago, they were doing up a lot of the Jewish cemeteries in Glasgow. And there's a Jewish cemetery in Janefield. Janefield is behind, if I can mention that, Celtic Park. I don't know if you can mention it here. But behind Celtic Park, where the Celtic team play, there is a Jewish cemetery. And it had been totally forgotten about. And a lot of work was done with the Glasgow City Council and the community. And I was there to make sure things were being done in the Jewish, following the Jewish rules. And what was so, a cemetery tells a story. And the story that I saw over there was a row of three or four graves, and with names. And it was children between the ages of 8 and 4 or 3. All died within 3 days of one another, of the same family, which just tells a story of an epidemic or something going on in Glasgow. And I was just taken by it. And all this was everywhere, and just not just the Jewish community, but every community in Scotland. So we had this orphanage. All these charities were founded by inspiring men and women, influencers. Some of them were communal leaders, and others were just your everyday housewife and your everyday workman, working hard to make ends meet for the growing family. However, each one, for their own reasons, was inspired to do something for the betterment of the less fortunate. I would like to share with you the names of just two of amongst many. The first lady is the late Mrs. Sophie Janine. Mrs. Janine became a walking and breathing institution through her incredible generosity for those in need. Today, the old-timers refer to Mrs. Janine as Janines, deleting the Mrs. Sophie owned the Janine's Hotel and Restaurant in Abbotsford Place, and it became a vibrant community hub until its closure in 1965. However, what made it into an institution was her accommodating new immigrants who arrived in Glasgow penniless. She provided dowries for poor brides, entertaining Jewish soldiers in wartime, and giving employment to refugees. Her children and grandchildren, and some of those grandchildren are still alive today, were forced to give up their own beds and share with siblings so that their bed can be given to newly arriving immigrants. Her incredible charitable heart set the bar very high for the community and was the inspiration for so many of their own people in their own charity work. A truly inspiring influencer. Another inspiring person was Mrs. Carrie Hill, a pioneer and lady way ahead of her time. In 1990, one of the first projects that I was involved in was conducting the Glasgow Yeshiva Boys Choir. This was a group of young boys with very sweet voices, and we would go around performing at different community events. The way we encouraged the children to join and stay in the choir was by promising them that they will perform in the near future at Madison Square Gardens. The children didn't know where this was, and that in order to make it look busy, we need to attract at least 30,000 people. But the promise worked, and we performed. The furthest place we performed in was at Edinburgh Hebrew Congregation. You have to start somewhere. One of the most beautiful performances of the choir's short life, was the evening we performed at St. John's Road, Cosgrove Care Centre. Let me share with you what I wrote in the Cosgrove Care's brochure celebrating its 60th anniversary. And I wrote as follows. My first encounter with Cosgrove Care was in 1990, when I took the Glasgow Yeshiva Boys Choir to perform at St. John's Road, Cosgrove Care Centre. This was a time when men and women with special needs were not fully understood and were not provided with any opportunities. And in many other communities, they were still hidden away from society. This was far from the truth that evening. That evening, I met the most beautiful and happy men and women, the Cosgrove Care family, who were singing, dancing, and laughing, making that evening a most memorable one. I was also introduced to the pioneers at Cosgrove Care, those incredible people who with love and patience helped the men and women of the Cosgrove Care family to integrate into the community and make sure they were at the heart of the community. They also educated the community to welcome the Cosgrove Care family and consider them as equal and valued members of the society. 30 years later, Cosgrove Care continues to be pioneers, enabling all people to enjoy life and realize their potential. The Jewish Association for the Mentally Handicapped today is Cosgrove Care and serves not only the Jewish community, but a majority of its service users are from the wider community. The pioneer behind this incredible forward-thinking organization more than 60 years ago was Mrs. Carrie Hill. Carrie had a daughter with special needs, and the services available to her and the family were, if there was anything, it was very limited. Carrie's main concern was, what will happen with her daughter and other children who with similar situations when their parents become too old and frail to deal with the many needs their children require? She approached Reverend Dr. Cosgrove with her concerns, and so was born the Jewish Association for the Mentally Handicapped, which provided a residential home equipped with all the support necessary to allow the residents to live independently, taking a large weight off the parents' shoulders. Carrie Hill was a housewife with a challenge who stepped up, faced the issue head on, and made Cosgrove Care happen. The list goes on and on of the people who are at the heart of the establishment of Scottish Jewry. However, if you do research on many of these organizations, and I do have to say I'm very much focused on the Glasgow community because that is where I am and it's the largest in Scotland. If you do research on many of these organizations, you'll find two names mentioned over and over again, and they are brothers, Ephraim and Michael Goldberg. They were pioneers in business. Their department stores, Goldberg's, became the precursor to how department shops work today, and they were legendary in the business world. However, I will say that the greatest achievements, and one that showed their real personalities, was the setting up of the community trust. I can honestly say that so much of why there is still a strong community in Glasgow and beyond is because of this trust that they set up in 1963. The story of how this trust was set up is an example of what could be achieved when people put aside their own ego and work solely for the benefit of the community. Recently, a book was published which is called More Than Just a Helping Hand, which was to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the setting up of the trust. At the heart of this story is the rejection of an incredible offer. Towards the end of the first half of the 20th century, members of the community of the 21st century, members of the community were becoming more established in the world of commerce, allowing them to move out of the slums of the Gorbals. As new homes began popping up all over Giffnock and Newton Mearns, the area became very popular, and people began moving into these new homes. This created a need for a new synagogue. And in 1938, the purpose-built synagogue was opened, of Giffnock Synagogue, Giffnock Shul as we refer to, in May Terrace. However, within 25 years, the membership had outgrown its building, and the debate of how to address this problem was raging. Some felt that the answer is expansion on the premises, but this was a problem due to the limited space available to expand. On the main road in Giffnock, Fenwick Road, at the heart of Giffnock, there was the Tudor Cinema, which was, beside being a cinema, it also contained a cafe, restaurant, and a function suite. However, by this time, it was in decline, and the owners were looking to sell. The two brothers, Ephraim and Michael Goldberg, went ahead and bought the Tudor building, offering it to Giffnock and then Newland's Hebrew congregation as a perfect space to build a new and larger synagogue. One thing I found out about synagogue committees is that you have two people and three opinions. And after much debate and politics, and due to a public toilet on the premises, this offer was rejected. The synagogue eventually bought the Glen, which was just up the road, and it was surrounded by few acres of land on which the current synagogue, today known as Giffnock Newton Mearns Synagogue, was built. Now, this is where the story takes an incredible turn. Let me quote from Malcolm Livingston, former chairman of the trust. He writes as follows: the Goldberg brothers had bought the Tudor cinema and offered it to Giffnock Synagogue, but the synagogue rejected it. Now, many people who make such substantial offer would have said, to hell with it. Not the Goldbergs. They approached other members of the community to create the community trust. Let me tell you that there isn't a Jewish institution in Scotland that has not benefited in some way from the trust. And I believe that they supported the Aberdeen synagogue recently in some refurbishments. The trust is not just a money provider. It's much more than that. The trust has been a driving force with a vision and encourages those who benefit to have a vision. And it is all because of a humility of people who are true influences, the Goldberg brothers. And one of the main areas of their support is education, another key component in every Jewish community. And with this, I will conclude. One of the roles that I have the honor to hold is to serve as being chaplain to Calderwood Lodge Primary School, the only Jewish school in Scotland. The school is unique for many reasons. One of the historic reasons is that it's today a joint campus school with a Catholic primary school. There are many joint campuses schools in Scotland and around the world. But this school is the only one in the world, we believe, that is a joint campus school with a Catholic school, St. Clair's Primary School. And I think your grandfather will be very proud of that. I'd like to share with you a conversation I had just yesterday with a young man, a past pupil at the school and engaged to get married in a few months. This young man today heads a financial company and has his own non-profitable business in advocating for Israel within the world of commerce, which is currently a very challenging project. He went through the Glasgow system like all other children. He attended synagogue with his father and grandfather, was a pupil at Calderwood Lodge before attending Hutchison Grammar School. So I asked him if any bit of his childhood inspired him to do the work he's doing today. His reply scared me, and it gave me pleasure at the same time. He said that part of it is a speech I gave when he was in primary 3. He was just 7 years old. Never mind the speech, and never mind he is remembering a speech from more than 18 years ago. What really struck me is the responsibility that us leaders have and the impact we can have on others. It is this responsibilities, these leaders, and just everyday members of the community that I mentioned earlier. It's this responsibility that they displayed in their work who energize me and others. Let me conclude with a question. How will the next 20 years be for Scottish Jewry? What I do know is that there is a palpable fear in the community, an insecurity that I have never experienced before. The anti-Semitism that has reared its ugly head in many different ways has rocked the confidence of the community. But standing here tonight, giving the Hay of Seaton lecture in memory of the late Malcolm Hay of Seaton, a man who saw the horrible outcome of anti-Semitism, and it's not stopped, and how bad and what the dangers when it's not stopped in its track. A man who dedicated his final years in trying to come to grips and understanding the source of anti-Semitism. Even if what he wrote was not popular, he continued to fight against this blight on society. It is his memory that gives me hope. We remember this evening Alice Ivy Hay of Seaton, Malcolm's widow, whose bequest made this evening possible. One of the messages I have been sharing with my community is that at times that darkness seems so dark that we cannot see how the light will ever shine again. However, there's always light waiting to burst through the darkness. And when that happens, that light is far brighter than we could have ever imagined. Tonight, we remember two people who were the light in a very dark time. And their light will continue to force its way into any darkness we might be feeling. Angus, together with Malcolm and Isabella, may the light be one of blessings to you and your families. Thank you.